You have tried to explain something simple to someone, and they just did not get it. But what if the problem is not their comprehension, but your own brain? How can knowing something too well actually make you worse at communicating it? The obvious answer is that you just need to speak more clearly. Use simpler words. Break it down step by step. Yet that obvious answer collapses when you realize that you have already done all of that and it still failed. The other person still stared back with a blank expression, or nodded only to prove moments later that nothing landed. So what is really going on? Consider a specific example. A friend asks you how to change the toner in your printer model. You have done it 100 times. You say open the front panel, pull out the old cartridge, slide in the new one, close the panel. But your friend cannot open the front panel because they do not know there is a tiny latch on the side that you always press without thinking. You forgot to mention it because it is now subconscious. The instruction was incomplete, and you had no idea. Another common situation is explaining how to get somewhere using landmarks you know. You say turn left at the big oak tree, but the other person does not know which tree you mean. You used a reference point that only exists in your mental map. The curse makes your mental model seem universal, and it happens in nearly every conversation where one person has experience and the other does not. This is the curse of knowledge. It is a cognitive bias where once you know something, you cannot reconstruct what it was like not to know it. Your brain overwrites the memory of your own ignorance. You become unable to imagine the mental state of someone who lacks that information. And this gap silently sabotages every attempt to explain, teach, or give directions. The classic demonstration comes from a 1990 experiment by Elizabeth Newton at Stanford. She had participants tap out the rhythm of a well-known song like Happy Birthday. Another group listened and tried to identify the song. The tappers predicted that listeners would get it about 50% of the time. The actual success rate was 2.5%. Tappers could hear the melody in their own heads, complete with tempo and lyrics, but listeners heard a series of disconnected taps. The tappers could not shed the information they already had. Another well-documented example comes from the study of hindsight bias, a close cousin of the curse. In a 1975 experiment by Baruch Fishoff, participants were given a historical scenario and the actual outcome. They massively overestimated how predictable that outcome was before they knew it. Once told that the British won a battle, they claimed they always thought it was likely. The impossible task is to forget what you now know. The same mechanism explains why sports fans shout obvious calls after the play. The brain rewrites the past to fit the present. And this same erasure of ignorance happens every time you try to teach something you have mastered. You cannot scrub the knowledge from your mind. This experiment directly parallels the tapper-listener task. In both cases, knowing the answer makes you blind to how opaque it was before. Another version of this is the knew-it-all-along effect, which has been replicated in dozens of studies. It shows that the curse is not just about explaining, but about judging others' predictions. When you know the answer, you inevitably think others should have known it too. This is not a failure of empathy. It is a structural limitation of memory. When your brain stores knowledge, it also stores the context and meaning around it. That context becomes automatic. You stop consciously accessing the raw facts because your mind has compressed them into a single concept. The word algorithm, for example, triggers a whole network of ideas for a programmer. For someone else, it is just a scary technical term. You cannot hear the word the way they do. The curse affects everyday communication more than you realize. Think of giving directions. You say, turn left at the old red building. But the other person has no idea which building you mean because they do not have your mental map of the neighborhood. You assumed your knowledge was shared. It was not. Or consider teaching a child a board game. You skip steps because the rules feel obvious to you. The child gets frustrated and loses interest. The curse made you a poor teacher. The second line of evidence comes from studies on perspective taking. Psychologists have shown that adults who are told the name of a product before hearing a description of it are much worse at guessing how someone else who does not know the name would describe it. They anchor on the information they have. Children under age 5 are actually better at this task in some experiments because they have not yet developed the habit of assuming others share their knowledge. The curse emerges as the brain matures. The curse also shows up in surprising places like product design. In the 1990s, a team of engineers designed a VCR remote with 40 buttons. They knew each button's function, so it seemed intuitive to them. Customers found it unusable. The engineers could not simulate the confusion of someone seeing the remote for the first time. This same problem persists today with software interfaces. A menu option labeled Optimize might mean one thing to a developer and nothing to a user. The designer's familiarity with the system blinds them to the user's confusion. The curse is not limited to verbal communication. It shapes every tool and interface we build. A famous example is the original iPhone, which had a simple interface because Steve Jobs insisted that users should not need a manual. The curse was deliberately designed against. That is rare. In contrast, many corporate software products are cluttered because the developers see every feature as equally important. They cannot unsee their own work. This is why user testing is so valuable. It forces experts to watch someone who does not know what they know. But there are limits to the curse. It is not absolute. It can be weakened when the other person gives clear signals of confusion. If a listener stops you and asks for clarification, you snap out of your internal perspective and adjust. The problem is that most people do not ask. They nod and pretend to understand to avoid embarrassment. So the curse persists because feedback is hidden. But there is a curious edge case where the curse of knowledge may actually help. In domains like comedy or magic, the performer knows exactly what the audience does not know. A magician exploits the gap between what they know and what the spectator knows to create surprise. The curse becomes a tool. The comedian knows the punchline and uses that knowledge to time the delivery. In these cases, the ability to hold two perspectives in mind, the true state and the naive state, is essential. The curse is still there, but it is flipped from a liability to an asset. Most everyday situations do not have this structure, but it proves that the curse is not an unbreakable law. It can be harnessed with training. Expert teachers and presenters learn to anticipate confusion, not because they have escaped the curse, but because they have practiced simulating a beginner's mind. That simulation is effortful, but it can become a skill. Can you overcome it consciously? Yes, but it takes effort. The most effective technique is to put yourself in the beginner mindset before you speak. Ask what the other person already knows. Then ask what they need to hear first. A programmer explaining code to a manager does not start with for loops. They start with what the code does for the business. A doctor explaining a diagnosis does not lead with the medical term. They describe the symptom in plain language first. Another technique is to check for understanding repeatedly, but not with a binary question like, "Do you get it?" The curse makes you interpret a yes as confirmation that you were clear. Instead, ask the other person to restate what you just said in their own words. That reveals the gap between what you intended and what they heard. It forces you to see the knowledge from outside. The curse has real consequences beyond awkward conversations. In the workplace, it causes project managers to underestimate how long it takes new hires to learn internal systems. They assume the system is intuitive because they designed it. In public health, experts fail to communicate risks effectively because they use technical probability terms that sound like random numbers to the public. In relationships, one partner assumes the other knows why they are upset because the reason feels obvious. The conflict escalates needlessly. Perhaps the most costly consequence of the curse is in the courtroom. A study by legal scholars found that judges, after learning the outcome of a case, overestimate how predictable that outcome was to the parties involved. They then make rulings based on what they now know rather than what was known at the time. This leads to unfair judgments. The same bias affects jurors who are given instructions in legal jargon that only lawyers fully understand. The curse of knowledge prevents the legal system from communicating clearly with the people it serves. Clearer jury instructions have been shown to reduce this bias, but the curse remains deeply embedded in the culture of expertise. Another real-world implication is in medical informed consent. Doctors may list risks using technical terms that patients interpret differently. The patient signs without truly understanding. The curse here has ethical weight. The curse of knowledge is not a character flaw. It is a feature of how memory and expertise work. The more you know, the harder it is to teach. The better you understand something, the worse you become at explaining it to a beginner. That is the paradox. You cannot unhear what you know, but you can learn to hear the silence on the other side of the conversation. And that is where real communication begins.